Davan, and I am a consultant in the public sector with a specific focus on climate change governance. We have 4 speakers today and 2 rounds of questions, but I'm happy to just take 1 round of questions and then we kind of have a free-flowing conversation because we all know each other. So just give you a brief introduction with some data which can feed the conversation slightly, and then I'll move on to the questions. We have about an hour or so. So just as a brief introduction, in 2026, a country's ability to connect to markets, to digital networks and global value chains seems to matter way more than its wealth and way more than what lies beneath its soil. Yet, one continent in Africa, logistic costs still consume 30 to 40% of goods value, so almost half of it, compared to less than 10% in developed economies. The continent faces an annual infrastructure financing gap of up to 170 billion, with, some would say, crumbling roads, congested ports, and fragmented rail networks isolating entire regions and peripheries. Yet, one example, Morocco, it exemplifies the paradox. It is a global crossroads between Europe and Africa, with still rural inequalities that persist. Digital connectivity offers promise, fiber, data centers, and networks, but also it raises urgent questions of sovereignty, dependency, and exclusion. The central question before us, and that we can debate during this session, is whether connectivity is a precondition for development, or can it be the result? And who gets connected, how and for whom, and who gets to decide? So let's debate. I'll briefly introduce our 4 speakers. We have from Mauritania, we have Mr. Mohammed Yaha, who's the CEO of Morilog, a logistics company. We have Thomas Pébé from France, co-founder and partner at Cillian Partners. We also have Mr. Radwan Karama, who is the country director of Sulimet Wiring Group here in Morocco. And from Nigeria, we have Mr. Innocent Iziche, who is the managing partner of ACIOE Associates. Welcome, warm welcome to our panelists. And I suggest we move on to the first question, round of questions. So moving to you, Mr. Yaha. So you run a logistics company in Mauritania, which is a vast country with, some would say, challenging terrain. So from your operational perspective, which infrastructure investment would you think unlock the most economic value for your clients? Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you for. Thank you. I want first of all to thank Amadeus for organizing this very important event, and I will rather speak in French. Donc, merci de m'avoir donné l'occasion d'ouvrir le bal. C'est une très très bonne question, d'autant plus que je suis un praticien depuis plus de 20 ans. Nous avons une plateforme sur le port de Nouakchott qui à l'origine servait le oil and gas pour les compagnies qui font de l'exploration et qui ont commencé à faire de la production, mais aussi les sociétés minières. Et avec les sociétés minières, nous avons eu à quand même développer une logistique qui doit aller sur des routes extrêmement dégradées, dans des zones difficiles pour aller vers les recherches de l'uranium, de l'or, du fer. Et nous sommes allés jusqu'aux frontières de l'Algérie, du Mali, du Sénégal, et nous avons donc vécu ce que vous avez décrit comme étant, comme étant de gros défis et surtout un déficit vous avez décrit les routes dégradées, l'absence d'infrastructures, la connectivité. Et ça, c'est donc des choses qui sont là, qui impactent aussi bien, et ça c'est un dilemme, la connectivité. Hein. C'est un peu l'œuf et la poule. Mais quand on voit l'impact premier que font déjà les infrastructures structurantes comme les ports, et ce qui va autour, on voit comment s'amorce le développement d'une chaîne de valeur. Et la Mauritanie étant positionnée, vous avez parlé tout à l'heure du Maroc comme étant un bridge entre l'Europe et l'Afrique, mais attention, pour arriver à l'Afrique, il y a la Mauritanie qui est le vrai pivot de tout ça, parce que nous sommes le passage vers l'Afrique. Et là, à partir de la Mauritanie, vous avez tous les enjeux. Vous avez les enjeux de la route, vous avez les enjeux des ponts, parce qu'il y a le fleuve Sénégal, il faut faire des ponts, et vous avez les enjeux d'une façade maritime atlantique de plus de 700 km, et d'un fleuve qui fait partie de l'Atlantique, le fleuve Sénégal, qui aussi, dont la navigabilité est extrêmement importante pour faire une intégration économique de tous ces pays. Ces pays ont des potentiels. Je ne veux pas être plus long, enfin, peut-être que ça va être d'autres questions, ou je continue. Parce que quand on regarde le potentiel des matières premières dans des pays comme le Mali, le Burkina, le Niger, les potentiels agricoles, la production du coton, la production de mangue, la production. Et quand on voit tous ces pays qui, pour acheter des intrants, importer des produits chez eux, des équipements, rien qu'une centrale électrique, c'est tout un problème à acheminer. Le retour, donner l'accès à ces produits pour en faire un flux commercial stable, c'est le challenge dans l'autre sens. Donc, mais ce qui nous rassure, c'est que l'Afrique, aujourd'hui, fait l'objet de l'attention, parce que c'est l'une des rares zones où il y a du potentiel de croissance, où il y a des matières premières qui deviennent indispensables partout, et où il y a une démographie galopante. Donc, tout le monde parle de l'Afrique comme étant la prochaine destination. Et quand on regarde en arrière, on voit 20 ans en arrière, quand on a en arrière certains pays d'Amérique latine ou certains pays d'Asie, où il y avait aussi des conflits politiques, il y avait des problèmes sociaux, il y a des déficits d'infrastructures. Mais il suffit d'amorcer un exemple pour que les autres suivent. Nous sommes très très rassurés par déjà cet exemple lancé par le Maroc et d'autres pays africains qui sont sur le chemin. Et voilà, moi je pense que l'avenir il est là parce que le potentiel est important.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Yara. Our second speaker, Thomas Bebe, from Cillian Partners. You work in the infrastructure finance sector. A question, so Africa needs up to 170 billion annually in infrastructure investment. External financing often comes with strings attached, as we know. How can African countries structure their deals, their infrastructure deals, in a way that builds connectivity without creating new forms of dependency, which we've been discussing all day? And the second question, which is part of the same question, what models actually work that you've seen? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So before we go to financing and the specific questions that you asked, I'd like to discuss a bit how the connectivity landscape is changing and the sovereign aspects that come with that change. Because I think when we talk about connectivity and we think about traditional telecommunication networks, it's about, for example, connecting one person to another for a video call or a normal call. Or it's about a user downloading data. For example, if you watch a video on YouTube or something like that. But I think the use case for connectivity is changing very fast because of AI, and now increasingly what we see in terms of what connectivity enables is a user that is going to send a request to an AI model, and it goes to the cloud, to a data center that we increasingly call an AI factory, and data is being computed, and then there's an output that has economic value that is produced and sent back to the user through that connectivity infrastructure. And so when we think about that connectivity infrastructure, it's evolving in a way where the data center in the cloud is increasingly a part of it, and I think that's really changing and in fact drastically increasing what is at stake in terms of sovereignty. For example, I think everyone uses AI today, and think about what happens if you do a chat GPT request out of Morocco. The data is going to go to a data center that is most likely operated by Oracle or Microsoft in the US. The actual economic value is going to be produced in a data center in the US using US technology. It's essentially today in that data center that's going to process the ChatGPT request, you would have those NVIDIA Blackwell GPUs that are going to be really the critical piece of infrastructure. And I think that is a real sovereignty issue. We may not think about that, but when we use ChatGPT or any other AI service in Africa, essentially it's an import. We are importing a high-value service from the US. And so I think when we think about connectivity in Africa, there's obviously a lot of issues that needs to be solved, but I think we need also to anticipate a bigger one that comes very quickly afterward, and that is the sovereignty of AI. And so I think the 170 billion per year is a big investment, but probably it needs to be even bigger if we want to have in Africa actually the data center that are going to produce the value added from AI that is needed for economic development. I think that's really the first thing. I think is when thinking about digital infrastructure, AI is obviously a very important topic. Think about especially the agentic AI wave that is accelerating, and that's going to be very critical in terms of economic competitivity everywhere in the world and in Africa as well. So turning to financing, I think today beyond Africa, everywhere the amount of investment is staggering. You just take the hyperscalers in the US. It's 4 companies. This year, they are expected to spend north of $700 billion in data centers, and that is 80% higher than what they spent last year, which was about $400 billion, and that was 60% higher than what it was in the year before, in 2023. And it's not the end. The expectation is that next year the data center investment by the hyperscaler is going to be even higher. And I think it's interesting to see that those companies that are the most cash-rich companies, the most highly valued companies, many of them valued more than $1 trillion, even those companies are hitting a bit of the limits of what they can do on their own with their own balance sheets. And we've seen increasingly partnerships between the hyperscalers and other players. So we've seen partnerships with the private equity world. You may have seen yesterday, actually, an announcement that Google is going to build data centers financed by Blackstone, and that is one example among many. Many of the big private equity firms are now helping data center operators to finance that infrastructure. And we've also seen, actually, even more relevant when it comes to sovereign AI, we have seen the same with sovereign wealth funds. And in particular, in the Middle East, you have those projects like MGX in the UAE, Humane in Saudi Arabia, or QAI in Qatar. And I think, back to Africa, those gigantic investments that are required to create the connectivity, but also to ensure the sovereignty of everything that is produced by AI. I think it is indispensable that the financing comes from partnership with the private sector, and I think. Well, that answer, I think both of your questions is, one is where the money should come from, and the other one is what is the model. And I think the one answer to those two questions is for that investment to happen, it needs to be partnerships with financial player from the private sector, and private equity is one answer. Sovereign wealth funds, maybe from the Middle East, are another answer, I think.
Thank you very much. Up next, Innocent Iziche. You operate in Nigeria and across Africa, and many of the cities have made tremendous infrastructure gains, but a lot of peripheries still face inequalities. From your experience, what is the single biggest non-financial barrier to extending connectivity to underserved areas and underserved markets, based on your experience, and what have you seen overcome? Maybe an example. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a very good question, and if I could, I think there are two ways I would look at it. I remember one of our clients, which is a really big FMCG, global FMCG. And one of the things they wanted to do was to take advantage of the ECOWAS protocols to get, in terms of, from a tariff perspective, to move goods within the ECOWAS region. And they noticed that to move goods between Nigeria and Senegal was going to take over 3 months. And so for them, it was better to it's better to bring it from Europe to Senegal than, and so when you looked at the tariff gains in itself, it was not enough to compensate for the cost of moving those goods internally within the ECOWAS region. So one of the things you sort of have to think about ultimately is what are the factors. So the infrastructure connectivity is something that one ultimately has to look at, and who is actually going to pay for that infrastructure to enable this free flow of goods or at a cheaper cost. But in your second question, I think this speaks more to my experience. In the case of Nigeria, one of the things we saw, particularly around connectivity, delivery of financial services, is that a lot of what we saw was really concentrated in the urban areas, right? A lot of the innovations you are seeing around payments, because Nigeria has actually made a huge leap. I think if there's any model on payments that people can actually look at, from the interoperability, the innovations that have come in, the investments that have come into these funds, the settlement times, it's really a model that I think people talk about Kenya, but I think Nigeria is the real model. But what you saw was in the hinterlands, in the rural communities, you saw less less build up of infrastructure for a while. So broadband penetration, I think, was one of the key things that we saw in Nigeria. And I think roughly about 30,000 kilometers of, Nigeria has about 30,000 kilometers of broadband availability, compared to the size of the country, which is maybe 150,000 square kilometers. So what you've seen is that the government eventually decided to work on a blended financing approach, because the whole idea was, we've seen the gains from what the gains have accrued to the economy as a result of stronger penetration of digital financial services. And so the idea was, look, there's a case to be made on building up that infrastructure, because the existing infrastructure, particularly in the rural communities, was too weak to power a good number of the innovations, and also in accessibility of data, right? So what you saw was, it's called Project Bridge. It's about $2 billion. And it's financed by the government. The government, they created a SPV. The government is actually it has a 17% stake. Then you have other partners, private sector partners, including the World Bank, EBRD, and the African Development Bank, who are all helping to support. The whole idea is, if this kicks off, and they're hoping to kick it off, I think, by the end of this year, they'll begin to, at least to help to increase penetration, help to provide better connectivity. Because one of the things we've seen is, even within that limited infrastructure, you had technology companies, fintech companies in Nigeria providing last mile service, but on a poor infrastructure platform. But notwithstanding that, we've seen those gains, so you've had better access to financial services. But I think we could gain more by leveraging on some of these blended financing approaches to improve connectivity in the rural communities in particular. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I'll give the floor to other panelists to reflect shortly after we give the floor to Mr. Karama, Radwan Karama from Sulimet, Morocco. My question to you, you work on the ground with electrical and wiring infrastructure. So before we even get to digital connectivity and making it work, so before fiber optics, before data centers, you need reliable electricity. How do you prioritize between expanding the power grids versus rolling out digital networks, given that every fiscal space, every budget is limited? Thank you.
So thank you for the question. Thank you for Amadeus for the invitation. So happy to be here, sharing insights with the team. And happy as well to share all what I have witnessed over the last 15 years, the success story of the automotive sector in Morocco, the boom that we have, let's say, triggered in 2002 under the leadership of His Majesty, and with the first automotive project, and then we see all of us the results and also the evolution and the trajectory of this story. So about your, let's say, question, yes. So the connectivity, I think. So it is first of all, is it a prerequisite for the development? We should not wait to get or to have money to get infrastructure, but we need to first to, let's say, to start with the infrastructure to contribute to the development of the country. This is obvious, and I will take some example from my sector. So for the automotive, so we have this success story thanks to the port and all the highways that Morocco was building over the last 20 years. And we see that at this moment, or last year, we are at $15 billion exports from Morocco, which is the top one export sector value, which is automotive. And about the budget, I think the solution for the funding, so the key, in my opinion, so it's not to, let's say, to look for one solution, but to look for several solutions to avoid dependency. Because I think concentration is bringing dependency. I think if we have, let's say, several players, several methods of funding, so we are, let's say, we can get better conditions, and also we can get better formulas for the funding. I would like as well to emphasize the physical infrastructure before coming to the digital infrastructure, because I think, in my opinion, the two layers is not separable, digital and physical infrastructures. These should, let's say, go together, and we should not separate. But first, I would like to discuss about the physical infrastructure. As I said, so, and this is a statement that I will share with you, which is a very, very clear, and also the insight is so in the last century, the countries were protecting borders, but now the countries are protecting connections. And this is the huge work that we have as African countries, to build first connections between us, and then to protect those connections through, let's say, trade, through flows of goods, flows of people, and flows of funds. So this is the first element, because we have as well some success story in Europe, like Slovakia, which is only 5 million population, and they are producing almost 1 million cars per year. So it's very, I think it's among the highest GDP per capita for automotive, and because Slovakia is in the middle of the corridors in Europe, is in the middle of railways, is in the middle of the highways in Europe, and they are taking fully profit of this, let's say, situation, and they are standing and using those levers to improve the industry and to improve the profitability of the industry, of automotive industry. So as well, so we have in Morocco also a good example, and we have as well other example in other African countries. And this is, let's say, so in my opinion, first, so we need to build infrastructure, physical infrastructure, to get connected to the world, to the global flows, and then build and work on the digital infrastructure, and to have innovative solution, to have funding from several players, global players, to have a good condition, and to have to not, let's say, to not make pressure in our budget, because, you know, in all African countries, so investment budget is not so high compared to the others. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anyone on the panel who would like to reflect on what was said by another panelist?
Moi, je ne sais pas si je commence par lequel, parce que tout ce qu'ils ont dit est absolument pertinent et décrit clairement les enjeux, mais surtout les bons exemples que Karama a donnés, parce que c'est ça qui est intéressant, parce que si on voit que la moitié est vide du verre, on n'avancera jamais. Et ce qui est intéressant dans ce qu'a dit Karama, c'est les exemples concrets des pays qui ont trouvé le bon chemin et qui ont surtout su tirer le meilleur profit de leurs atouts. Le Maroc, pour les projets qu'il a lancés dès le début, les infrastructures, le climat des affaires, la vision. La Slovaquie qui a dit, tiens bien, nous sommes au centre. Et ça nous rappelle aussi Dubaï qui a dit, tiens, nous sommes exactement là où il faut pour développer un hub. Et c'est ça les grands. Malheureusement en Afrique, ce qui est absent, c'est justement ces centres de hub. On ne les trouve pas. Ils sont dans l'extrémité. Ils sont au Maroc, ils sont peut-être en Afrique du Sud, mais tout ce grand estomac africain, qui est un estomac d'éléphant, on ne trouve rien autour. Et c'est là le vrai enjeu qui, à mon avis, va faire l'objet, enfin c'est pour moi évident, sur les masses d'argent qui circulent et qui ont besoin. Et puis surtout aujourd'hui la maturité. Il y a une évolution très très forte grâce justement à ces exemples de partenariat public-privé, grâce à ces exemples de succès, de Hong Kong d'abord, Singapour, Dubaï, aujourd'hui le Maroc, qui vont donner à l'Afrique l'envie de ce qu'on appelle les envies imitatives, comme dirait René Gérard. C'est ça qui va, à mon avis, créer l'émulation. Et cette émulation va déteindre. Donc, vraiment, je salue l'intervention des panélistes, l'explication des montages financiers, comment ça se passe, et puis des exemples de projets concrets et des visions stratégiques. Voilà, c'est tout ce que...
Merci beaucoup. And what about you, Thomas?
Je réagis volontiers aussi sur ce qu'a dit Radouane, parce que cette discussion sur la connectivité, moi je l'ai personnellement prise sur un angle très connectivité digitale, et c'est un petit peu mon tropisme personnel et professionnel, mais ce que je trouvais intéressant dans l'intervention de Radouane, c'était de recentrer le débat sur la connectivité au sens plus large, et notamment la connectivité physique, les infrastructures autoroutières, ferroviaires, portuaires, etc. Je trouve que c'est un angle très intéressant, et ça m'a invité à réfléchir aussi à cette chose formidable qu'on a vue dans les dernières 20-25 années, qui est l'émergence très rapide de la Chine comme l'usine du monde. Et je pense qu'on le voit aujourd'hui, c'est absolument fascinant. Tout est fabriqué en Chine. On l'a vu l'année dernière, malgré la mise en place des barrières douanières aux États-Unis qui étaient supposées nuire à la Chine, les exportations chinoises ont considérablement augmenté en 2025. Quand on regarde dans le futur, j'entendais ce matin un panel dans lequel quelqu'un a dit que en 2050, la population africaine serait plus importante que la population chinoise, et que 70% de cette population aurait moins de 35 ans. Là où la population chinoise serait une population avec une moyenne d'âge beaucoup plus élevée. Et déclinante très rapidement. Et je fais le lien avec la connectivité parce que je pense qu'il y a une opportunité très significative pour l'Afrique de devenir l'usine du monde à long terme. Et je reviens sur les sujets de l'intelligence artificielle que j'ai évoqués. On a vu l'intelligence artificielle générative, on a vu l'intelligence artificielle agentique qui est en train de décoller aujourd'hui. Et il y a une attente que la prochaine vague de l'intelligence artificielle, au-delà de 2030, ce sera l'intelligence artificielle physique, avec notamment les robots. Et on le voit, c'est notamment un sujet sur lequel la Chine est très en avance, notamment parce qu'ils ont un problème de main-d'œuvre, et que donc, à terme, il faut remplacer l'ouvrier par un robot. Mais la réalité, c'est que l'intelligence artificielle physique, elle n'est pas scalable comme l'intelligence artificielle générative ou agentique. Et la réalité, c'est que l'ouvrier humain restera probablement plus économique à long terme que le robot. Et donc il y a, dans cette situation de déclin démographique en Chine et de démographie très forte en Afrique, il y a des opportunités industrielles. Et ces opportunités industrielles, comme le disait Radouane, elles nécessitent une connectivité physique qui permet de déplacer les marchandises au sein du continent et d'exporter les marchandises en dehors d'Afrique toute une infrastructure qui doit être mise en place en parallèle de l'infrastructure digitale. Et je me joins totalement à ce qu'il disait, Radouane. Effectivement, l'investissement doit précéder le développement économique pour que l'Afrique en bénéficie.
Thanks. I love the point he made in reference to Slovakia and what helps to support greater exports of automobiles from Slovakia. I think, we've just been following recently, looking at the impact of the Strait of Hormuz crisis on movement of sourcing of petroleum products. And I think we've seen inflation spike in key African markets like in South Africa, Kenya. And one of the things that countries are looking at is really on this energy security. And one of the things that they have also been looking at is the Dangote refinery that came up in Nigeria, the largest refinery in Africa. And some of the things that are emerging from it is that because Kenya and South Africa relied a lot on getting their petroleum products from the Middle East, they have been significantly affected. Now they're trying to figure out how do you get it from other parts of it, like from Nigeria in particular. But two things have come up, and I think the owner of the refinery pointed out. One, he talked about the logistic cost, that the cost of moving goods within Africa. That's something that also comes in now that countries are also beginning to try to see how they can source petroleum products from Nigeria, for example. The second cost, I think, which you need to look at is really on the payment infrastructure, right? Intra-Africa payments within Africa in itself, intra-African payments, cost as much as in some cases between 8 to 10%, right? So it's a cost that we have to think about. How do we build the payment infrastructure that can help to enable greater trade? I know PAPS is there, but the idea is how do you make it more effective to make easier for example, for people to transact maybe between Morocco and let's say Ghana or Nigeria and Kenya. Those costs, those implicit costs, help to deter business in itself. So I think it's just also good to look at how do we build greater payment infrastructure. Yes, PAPS is one of it. People have also talked about stablecoin rails that can sort of leapfrog over some of the infrastructure issues that we have in the region. Thanks.
So thanks for the precious intervention and also the insight shared by my colleague, the panelists, and also the important ideas that were discussed. So yeah, I think we agree all that we have a huge opportunity ahead of us, and we need to catch it. And this is clear for everybody. I think in Africa, I will give some numbers, some shocking numbers. And so in Africa, we have the largest FTA in the world. We have the largest free trade agreement in the world. But at bottom line, so the exchange between the African countries is less than 10%. While if we compare it to Asia or to Europe, so Europe is almost 65% and Asia is 50%. So this is a huge opportunity, as I said at the beginning, in front of us to close the gap and also to work on, let's say, the opportunities that we have. I think some of the items or some of the topics has been already discussed about the cost. So in Africa, so we have almost 30-40% logistics cost for, let's say, to move the goods between the countries. Between Morocco and Europe, we have almost less than 8% cost. With Morocco and Asia, we have less than 10%. So this is, so the numbers are speaking. So the second point, and this is, let's say, this is what we should build, I think, progressively due to the budget and also the investment constraint, is to, let's say, to create clusters in Africa, because the continent is huge and we need to start working on the clusters, west, east, south, north, and then connect as a second step the clusters between them through, let's say, co-funding or co-investment funding between the countries and between the government. The last point is also important, is because up to now in Africa we don't have a corridor from the official corridor or known corridor in Africa, moving the goods from the south to the north and from the east to the west. So we have a fragmented, let's say, areas with a lot of difficulties to connect. And in average, I can give you some examples. For example, for 1,000 kilometers road, we have almost 20 checkpoints, police, customs, and so on. In Europe, we can have more than 3,000 kilometers without any checkpoints. And this is clear how we are regarding the, let's say, the physical connectivity in Africa. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes left. We have about 6 minutes left. Maybe a question to all of our panelists. Is there an example, a project or, I mean, in development, or an idea or proposition of building on what you say, Redouane, is there a multi-country project being worked on at the moment to overcome such, and I'm talking about beyond FTAs, beyond political cooperation that outlast cycles, political cycles or election cycles? Is there, multi-year projects between different countries to extract and maybe move raw materials or goods? Is there anything that comes to mind?
I think, thanks for the question. I think the one that comes to mind is clearly PAPS, but that's really around our payment infrastructure, right? I know efforts have been made to see, the idea is, how do you get some skill in terms of where there's a use case that companies, even individuals, find the PAPS infrastructure as a reliable one to make cross-border payments. I think the verdict is still out there, but it's something that one is keen to see how that will work and what solutions could come out of that. With regards to infrastructure, I think looking at some of the projects, particularly even in West Africa on the highway, I think the Lagos-Abidjan highway, and I think that's something that has been in the works. What comes out of it, I know that some work has been done, but we haven't necessarily seen extensive work around that. But that's an initiative I think that one will pay a lot of close attention to. The other aspect I think has always that usually came up in the past, but I think now is becoming quite salient, is really on the gas pipeline infrastructure between Africa that eventually connects to Europe. I think it's become probably more salient now, given what we're finding in the Middle East and Europe's relationship with Russia. So the idea is, where do you, from an energy security perspective, having that access to diverse sources is critical. So the idea is, how do you take advantage of, how do you connect? And I think in building that sort of infrastructure, the gas infrastructure, it's not only the fact that it can serve Europe from Africa, but it can also be used to serve other African countries along that corridor.
Thank you. Any question from our audience? Yes.
Alors, bonjour à tous. Donc, j'aimerais remercier l'Institut Amadeus pour cette invitation très chaleureuse. Donc, ma question est pour Monsieur Yahya. Monsieur Yahya, donc, vous avez évoqué la question de l'intégration régionale. Je me permets bien évidemment de vous dire qu'il ne faut pas oublier, nous, les États insulaires. On fait face à des difficultés structurelles, des difficultés d'infrastructure. Donc, ma question est que comment ces États peuvent-ils se connecter avec les autres États africains, sachant bien évidemment qu'ils trouvent des difficultés à s'intégrer dans des zones de libre-échange régionales, allant de l'opérationnalisation de la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine. Merci beaucoup.
Vous êtes de quel pays? Ah, très bien. Ah ben, les îles Comores. Hein. Ah ben, écoutez, vous posez une question extrêmement intéressante, parce qu'on oublie qu'en Afrique, il y a des pays qui sont aussi des pays insulaires. Ben, écoutez, la solution, elle est d'abord politique. Il faut que les décideurs politiques eux-mêmes créent les conditions économiques. Que quand on a un problème, on doit analyser quelle est la part que le gouvernement doit mettre dans la corbeille pour que les privés trouvent la rentabilité. Donc ça commence par le climat des affaires, les conditions, la réglementation, puis après ce qu'on appelle des fonds d'accompagnement. Et là, ce qui ça comble le gap, parce que généralement, c'est des opérations, vu la masse, qui ne sont pas économiquement intéressantes, mais tout ça fait de l'analyse. Et quand le gouvernement aura créé les conditions, parce qu'il faut qu'il analyse lui-même la problématique, fait la matrice de ce qu'il faut pour que les supports permettent de servir de tremplin sur lequel le privé peut se mettre, et après le privé viendra faire le business. Mais ça commence toujours par les décideurs politiques. La volonté politique. Ça, c'est comme ça que je vois les choses. C'est pas le financier, peut-être qu'il a...
Je me sens pas très compétent pour commenter sur ce sujet.
Je crois que ça sera le mot de la fin puisqu'on est out of time. Thank you so much to our panelists for this really interesting conversation and great interventions. And I also want to thank the Amadeus Institute for the invitation and organizing this event. Thank you so much.